But have you ever been in the fight of your life? Have you ever felt like, gosh, it really is a matter of life or death? Raise your hand if that's you, if you've been there. Boy, raise them high. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. It's a bit of a common experience. And yet the crazy thing is, if I say it's a matter of life and death, there is no death. That's what we're here to talk about. But that fight, how do I possibly get to the next breath? How do I possibly make that happen? I'm so thrilled to be here with my good friend, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. And probably the most amazing part of this story is a human interest story. No, the doc has been a level 1 trauma ER physician for 25 years. And he has seen incredible things in the ER. The experience that he had with me and my accident is one of many things that he's experienced in the ER. Are there any clinicians or medical staff out there too? Raise your hands high. Wow, very good. Thank you. I always find it very, it just puts wind in my sails when I know that a doctor, a clinician, one whose reputation is on the line, one who's been trained, one who literally saves lives or keeps souls here for a little longer, and sometimes a lot longer, is willing to talk about the spiritual things that go beyond that physical and the medical experience. And I'm gonna turn it over to the doc and let Dr. O'Driscoll talk about his 25 years in the ER and some of the things that he experienced and witnessed. And you'll just have to put up with both of us up here dancing on the stage. We'll tag team this a little bit back and forth. But as I introduce the doc, let's give him a big, big hand for being brave enough and courageous enough as a doctor to step forward and talk about spiritual things. And give him a hand big enough they can hear it clear out in the hallway. So give my good friend, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, a big hand.
Thank you. I'm Jeff O'Driscoll. As has been said, I've been an emergency physician for 25 years. And in a level 1 trauma center, that means seeing just about everything you can imagine and some things you can't. I mean, I've literally taken care of people who had their arm ripped off by a lion, who were stepped on by an elephant, one who was bitten by a Pakistani pit viper. We had to get anti-venom off the black market in the middle of the night. It was pretty wild. And one of my patients was Jeff Olson, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. But we kind of decided to switch things up a little bit today. Talk less about some of our spiritual experiences that you're familiar with or that are familiar to a lot of people, and give a little bit more backstory, because almost invariably when I talk about my experiences in the ER, some of my spiritual experiences, people say, well, when did this start? And how do you start having these experiences? And those are questions I never pondered until I started to share. For 20 years, Jeff invited me to come with him and speak, and I always declined. And then one day I woke up, and for some reason it kind of felt okay. And I started to share, and Jeff set up my first formal speaking engagement in, of all places, Salem, Massachusetts. So after 20 years...
I do that to him from time to time, yeah. Just to keep him on his toes.
So after 20 years of refusing to talk about seeing souls leave their bodies at death, he sets up my first speaking engagement in Salem. I said, are you serious? He goes, it'll be fun. We'll have a great time. So when I was 11 years old, a couple members of my mother's family, her sister and her sister's husband, my uncle, and her mother, walked into our door. We lived in a small town, and the door was never locked, and they were family. They never knocked. And they just walked in with this horrible, solemn look on their face, and they asked me, where's your mother? And I said, she's downstairs. And without saying a further word, they turned and went downstairs and closed the door behind them. And a few moments later, I heard this agonizing cry from my mother when she learned her firstborn son was dead. from tipping a tractor over. And I thought I got through that unscathed, but 20 years later, my brother came to me and he said, there's things our mother's never told you about the day I died, and you need to go talk to her, because she's never told you. So 20 years later, I go and visit with my mother. And one of the things she told me that day was, I always knew where you were in the house before Stan died because I could hear you singing. And when Stan died, you stopped singing. I was 11. So I never knew that. It must have had some psychic impact on my soul that I didn't really realize for a long time. And he still comes to me. He's come to me as recently as 6 months ago and teaches me things along the way. And as was mentioned by the person that introduced us, on one occasion when I was 16, I was driving 60 miles an hour in a Volkswagen Bug with some friends in the car on a narrow, windy country road after dark, and a voice spoke to me and said, you need to slow down. And I slowed down and I went around the corner and hit a Cadillac head on. This was before anybody wore seat belts. They were in the car, but they were just decoration. And nobody was hurt. There was a lot of damage to the car, but nobody was injured. And I think I probably would have died that night if I hadn't have slowed down. And for a long time, I didn't realize who that voice was or where it was coming from until I was much older and looking back, and I thought, I wouldn't have listened to any authority figure. I certainly wouldn't have listened to my parents. I don't think I would have listened to God if he'd have been sitting in the seat next to me and said it to me. But there was one voice I would listen to, and that was my brother. And I think that's who told me to slow down that night. So I share this as a little bit of a preamble to coming into the emergency department. Fast forward 20 years, or about 10 years, I guess. I walk into work one day, like any other day. I go to log into the computer, and I feel this profound spiritual presence. I know it's different for everybody, but for me it kind of starts in the center of my soul like a vibration, and it reverberates, ripples out to fill my whole body, and I recognize that there's a spiritual being there. And I understood who it was, and I went around the corner into the next room where they were trying to resuscitate a woman. They were literally doing chest compressions and giving her medications, trying to revive her. And she asked me for help, silently. She was unconscious, mind you. And so there was an empty spot on the gurney, and I walked over and I rested my hand on her leg, because I've learned that touch is so important in spiritual things. And as I did so, she asked me, can I leave? My first thought was, why are you asking me? But the doctor continued barking out orders. They continued chest compressions, and something came to me from some eternal place, and I told her silently, of course, because nobody else in the room knew what was going on. I said, listen, if you think it's time for you to go and you feel it's right for you, I think it's probably okay. And she rose up out of her body and stood in the air and filled the space with light and love. And she appeared to be about half the age of the body she'd just come out of. And she thanked me, and she left. And I walked out of the room. As I'm walking out of the room, I hear the doctor that's running the code. I had absolutely no responsibility for her medical care. I want to make that explicitly clear. Other doctors were taking care of her. And I inconspicuously walked out of the room. I heard the doctor in military time pronounce her dead. And I thought, yeah, I know. I saw her leave. And then I went and logged into the computer and started my shift. That's how my day started. So I grew up in rural Utah, just 25, 30 miles to the south. Jeff Olson grew up in rural Utah. I rode bulls. He rode bareback broncs.
I liked the horses. The horses didn't come after you got bucked off. The bulls did. So I think I was smarter, but we both played football. After we did a little talking and things, we concluded that,
He's 2 years younger. We concluded we probably were not on the field at the same time, but I was probably on the field with his older brother a couple of times playing football in rival schools. But we never knew each other. We never met. So let me tell you a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it back to Jeff, a little bit about the day we met. Or maybe you take off and tell a little bit about it.
Yeah. I'll never forget that day. And yet I didn't meet the doctor consciously. And as we were introduced, they said I had a horrific accident. Now, did you love Suzanne Giesman and what she had to share? Let me say, with every conviction I have at this point, there are no accidents. Everything is in perfect divine order. But what had happened is I was in the car driving with the entire family, and I lost control of the car. And we rolled, not off the road, but down the road at 75 miles an hour. And the police reports say the car probably rolled no less than 6 or 8 times. It was a horrific automobile crash. I left my body at that time, but only after realizing and having the knowledge that my wife and youngest child were gone. When the car came to a stop, all I heard was my 7-year-old crying in the back seat, and I wanted to get to him. You know, the reactions of a father, I've got to get to my boy. But that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was in incredible pain. I was not aware of my injuries. What had actually happened is both legs had been crushed. As was mentioned, my left leg was amputated above the knee. My back had been damaged, my lungs were collapsing, my right arm had almost been torn off, and the seatbelt had cut through and ruptured all my intestines. I didn't know. All I knew was my son was crying, but no one else was crying. And my youngest son, who was still in a car seat, the car seat had broken up and he had been ejected from the car. Which the absolute horror of, where is my little boy? And again, spirit, that knowledge, that net said, he's gone. And then Tamara, my wife, who had also reclined her seat back so the seatbelt didn't restrain her properly, she had suffered some very severe head trauma, which had taken her life. They were both killed instantly at the scene. I knew that as I lost consciousness. And yet that is also a very inaccurate representation, because in leaving the body, suddenly I became incredibly conscious. Far more conscious than in this realm. The doc teases me because I went to those other realms, which are right here, but it was like walking through a door. It was like when you walk from the hallway into the conference room. Suddenly I was in a different place, and there was no pain, there was no injuries, I could breathe perfectly. I thought, gosh, am I okay? And interesting enough, it was Tamara, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, and she was gorgeous. She was incredible. I mean, there she stood, more beautiful than I'd ever seen her. There was no head trauma. And yet she was emphatic that I go back. You've got to go back. You've got to go back. And I also learned a lot about choice. I mean, here was the woman I loved more than life. And yet I had a little boy I knew who was crying in the backseat of that car, Spencer, who was 7. And I made the conscious choice to come back. I mean, this has been over 20 years ago. I've learned a lot over those 20 years as I've rethought and processed what happened, but wow, choice, consciousness, accountability. But as I made the choice to come back, that's when I found myself wandering through a busy hospital, a level 1 trauma center. I have no concept of time, of this leaving from the body, this profound goodbye, and then finding myself in the hospital. I later found out I was life flighted. They had to, extract me from the car, and I was life flighted from there to the closest level 1 trauma center, which was in Salt Lake City. I didn't know any of that. I knew I had left this realm. I had been kicked out or sent back. But in wandering through the hospital, the consciousness was so alive. I was experiencing that oneness, that connection, that absolute, unconditional love. In such a profound way, it changed me forever. And yet, as I was saying goodbye to Tamra, the doc was saying hello, because he came into the hospital and, much like any other day, was logging in.
Yeah, I was in the hospital. There was one nurse that knew something about my spiritual experiences. She was the only one that had pried some of them out of me, because she had them herself, and she told me about some of hers, and she and I actually experienced this together. Jeff was in the trauma room. He'd been flown in from an outlying hospital. He was unconscious on the gurney. There was a crowd of people around him. Again, I had absolutely no responsibility for his care. There was 2 other doctors there taking care of him. But when I walked into the trauma room, I saw his motionless body on the gurney, and standing above him in the air was his deceased wife, Tamra, observing what was going on and expressing this profound gratitude. This is the same Tamra that kicked him out of heaven, said, "You have to go back." And Jeff and I joke sometimes. He says he had 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot in the grave, he says 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot on earth, and then they cut off one of his feet. So you know which foot was in heaven, the one they cut off, apparently, because he's still here. And we became friends, not initially because he was unconscious. We didn't even communicate that night. But there was this profound quietness in the room. It was like somebody turned the volume down on the television set, and everybody in the trauma room was still talking to each other, and they were still communicating, but I couldn't hear them anymore. They were all quiet, and Tamara was communicating with me. And there was this profound flood of knowledge, this download of the information kind of just floating in the air for anybody that was aware of it to take in. And I knew her. I knew who she was, though we'd never met. I knew Jeff. I knew he'd live. I knew he'd lose the leg. I knew all of these things in an instant, just at the moment. And I walked over and I looked down at Jeff and I checked the pulse in his leg, and I knew what kind of an injury he had in the leg. And I remember either saying out loud or thinking to myself, he's going to lose the leg. And as I was looking down at Jeff, I could still see Tamara standing behind me in the air, because I could see in all directions at the same time. And I could see what was beyond the typical physical barriers to this expansive vision. And I've had other experiences like that. People say, well, how did that affect you? And it had almost no effect on me, other than I took it in and I enjoyed it, and I went home and wrote in my journal. I've got a daily journal for 40 years. And I think the one sentence I wrote was, it was an interesting experience. Because I'd had so many. But it was a good experience, because a month later, this nurse came and started tugging on my arm, said, we have to go see Jeff. And I said, no, we don't. And she said, yeah, we got to go see him. And I said, listen, if you want to go talk with a perfect stranger about your spiritual experiences, you be my guest. But I'll keep them to myself. But she drugged me, kind of kicking and screaming, up to Jeff's hospital room. And we started to have a conversation, because now he'd had several surgeries, he'd lost his leg, and he was awake enough to talk. And so we started to visit a little bit.
And that was an interesting day, because here this couple, I thought was a couple, came in, this man and this woman, and I couldn't recognize them. Who are they? Are they, gosh, they're not from work, they don't live in the neighborhood, and I was still quite ill, but I couldn't place them, and then they introduced themselves.
Yeah, he was ill enough that, there's near-death experiences, there's shared death experiences, there's spiritually transformative experiences, and then what I thought Jeff had when he landed in my ER was what I used to call a damn near dead experience, because that's how he was still very sick.
Yeah, but as these 2 people came walking in the room, and Jeff makes me laugh. I love it. I make people cry. He makes people laugh. But here they came. And as they introduced themselves as members of my trauma team, I thought, gosh, what kindness, what compassion that they show up in my room to see how I'm doing. And we started off with small talk. And then it was the nurse who first started to get teary-eyed. And she said, we need to tell you why we really came. Now, they didn't know me from Adam. They didn't know that I had had an experience. And I want to honor this nurse for a moment. You ever get that whisper? We need to go talk to that guy. That whisper might say, gosh, I maybe should want to text Mom today. Maybe it says, I'm going to draw this picture with 2 roses at the base of a tree today. That whisper comes. Honor that whisper. Trust that whisper. Trust those feelings, those impressions, just like the doc and this nurse did when they came in and threw themselves out there, became completely vulnerable to go talk to this guy. The nurse teared up and she said, I want to share why we really came. She said, while we were working on you, there was your wife in the ER room, in the trauma room. And of course, I teared up and was crying. We both had Kleenexes. And she shared that feeling of love, that peace, that transformation within the room when that was going on. And I still wasn't sharing that I had had an experience. I was just listening and crying a lot. And I looked at the doc, he was kind of leaned over in the corner, kind of keeping his distance, away from this patient. And I looked at him.
You didn't tell me this for 20 years. Just a couple of years ago, you said, yeah, you stood in the corner and didn't say much. And I thought, that sounds like me. That's probably an accurate recollection.
Well, and I grew up with brothers. I mean, there was that male energy where here I am bawling in front of him and in front of her too. But I glanced over and he just gave me this acknowledgement that, yeah, she was there. And I thought, how cool is that? That, number one, I'm not crazy. Now, I didn't share my experience for years. I talked to the doc about it because he had opened up a safe place for me to do so. But that acknowledgement is, wow, everything that I have just gone through, which I knew was real to me, but it was really interesting to have 2 clinicians sitting there saying, hey, we experienced something as well. And that opened up a space and a door for me to connect with the doctor. Now, we probably broke every HIPAA rule in the planet, I don't know. But somehow we'd exchanged information and I knew how to find him. But he would still come and see me in the hospital. I was in the hospital for almost, gosh, it was over 5 months. I had 18 surgeries in all putting me back together. So it wasn't like I was going to disappear. They knew where I was. But the doc and I would have conversations and we talked very little about the accident. It was more about Tamra. When she came, what did she say? I asked him, what did she say? She was there, what did she say? And he told me very simply, she was simply sharing gratitude for what we were doing to save your life. See, she knew that we had that little boy that needed a dad. She knew that life was going to move on for me. She was connected into that web, and there she was sending gratitude to those doctors and nurses and teams that were doing everything they could to save my life. Now, when the doctor shared that and said she was simply sharing gratitude, I knew he was telling the truth. I'm like, that's exactly what she would do. She was a powerful soul here and she's a powerful soul there, and there's really no difference. That connection continues, and we'll talk about that more as well. But that opened the door for a beautiful friendship, and I thought, what a healer. There's doctors and there's healers. And based on having that veil peeled back and feeling the souls of everyone in that hospital, and having the continued communication from my wife, who was so beloved and is so beloved to me, all of a sudden here was this tangible guy in a white coat and a stethoscope that I could open up to and say, I had this happen. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I had some context for Jeff. Without going into any great detail, I'd had 5 years of this horrible, dark, heavy experience, carrying a spiritual burden for another soul. And it changed who I was. It was so horrible. I'll give you one example. I was going about my business in my house, and this horrible blackness closed in on me, so much so that I had to sit down because I thought I was going to fall. And the person I was helping, the person I was trying to spiritually support, had just lost her husband, and she had 6 children, and she's this young widow. And I call her Rebecca in my book. And on this day when everything closed in on me, and I sat down, and the foreboding was so heavy, I thought I was going to die. Mind you, I'm an emergency physician. I don't take this lightly. I literally thought I might die. And in that instant, a voice spoke to me and said, "This is how Rebecca felt the day her husband died." And that's just one of the things that I had been going through for about 5 years. And I was just finding my way out of this horrible thing when I met Jeff. And about another month after this visit we had in the hospital, we met for the first time outside the hospital. Jeff called me. I'd left him my phone number, which tells you something about the connection I felt to him when we met, that I left him my number. And he told me about some of the experiences he had outside of his body while he was in the hospital. Some really wrenching experiences. And I came home that night and I wrote in my journal for the very first time that I was grateful for the darkness because I knew how to help him. And I knew the answers to his questions, and he had a lot of them. Just less than, I think about 8 months ago, I woke up in the morning and a messenger came to me. And the messenger said, "Every experience is to enable you to help someone else." And I said, "Oh, wait a minute. I thought experiences were for personal growth. Then you could go help somebody if you wanted to." And the messenger said, "No, the primary reason for every experience is to enable you to help someone else. You get the secondary benefit of personal growth." Now, I don't know whether that applies to anybody else. I just know that's what I was told that day. And and one of the things that's made Jeff and I have a friendship now for over 20 years, coming up on 22 years, is this ability to have some empathy for each other and to help each other and to help heal each other. And it was some of these experiences that led to my personal mission statement. I have it on my business cards, I have it on my Facebook page, I have it on my website. I exist to help souls heal. And it was that day when I came home and I wrote that in my journal, that was the first time I thought of myself as a healer, even though I'd been a physician for years. That I knew the answers to his questions and I could help him. Jeff called me, in fact it was a conference call, it was a Zoom call we had a few months ago. He gets on the phone, he's smiling like he always is, but he says, "I broke my leg." I said, "What the hell, you need that leg. I mean, you only got one left." And he goes, "But the doc says I can just fix it with a couple new nuts and bolts." He was talking about his prosthetic leg.
Yeah, that one.
So we still have a lot of fun together, and we still learn from each other.
It's beautiful, but you can see that compassion and connection. I mean, I know so many experiencers that would never be able to talk to a medical doctor or a clinician of any kind. I mean, the interesting thing was here I had a safe place. I mean, isn't this an incredible conference? I mean, if we were talking like this out on the street, they'd probably still haul us off and lock us up and question us. But I had a safe place. Number one, Dr. Jeff was not family. You know, he was a newfound friend. But if I'd have sat down with my mom, she'd have said, "Oh, of course, Jeff, yes, we love you." Or if I'd have sat down with my brothers, they'd say, "What are you talking about? You know, get your pants on and let's get back to work." But here was this safe place to talk about the things I had experienced and to share that and to begin to heal. I think one of the most profound experiences in the hospital, and this is one of the first things I shared with Dr. Jeff when we began to talk at length. In fact, I forgot that I had told him this. I said, I really must have trusted you because I didn't talk about this for a long time.
He thought he hadn't told me until I read him a passage from my journal that I had recorded what he had told me.
If you don't keep journals, do that. I don't. I think, oh, it's still trap. It's all right here. Dr. Jeff has kept a journal for 40 years daily, so he could go back and he'd said, "No, you told me on this day what you'd experienced and what happened," which I found really cool. What had happened? Yeah, doctors like to keep journals. What had happened in the hospital, and this is going to be probably the theme of the whole weekend. I mentioned that Griffin, my little boy, had been thrown from the car. And all those months in the hospital, I had wondered, where is he? Is he okay? I had had interactions with Tamara almost on a regular basis, but I hadn't seen my little boy. On one particular night, and I think it's probably relevant to explain the two most profound out-of-body or near-death experiences I had were at the scene of the accident, before any morphine or narcotics had been administered, and at the end of my hospital stay, when I was off of all the narcotics and simply taking some Tylenol. But I felt that transformation. I felt that new realm. In fact, what it felt like was light came around me. This light that was so comforting. And I felt as if I began to rise above the hospital bed. And I thought, oh, I felt this before. I felt this at the accident. And Tamara came into the light, and I kept thinking, I'm going to see her, but this time I was all by myself. But the light began to dispense, almost like when a mist goes off a lake. And I found myself in the most beautiful place, the most incredible, beautiful place. And I began to run. Now, I can't emphasize how physical this felt. I was running and I could feel the warm ground under my feet, and I could feel the energy in every, what felt like cell of my body, charging up through my calves and thighs, and I was joyfully running. And everything in my entire being was saying, "You're home." I love when Suzanne said home with a capital H. It's the only word I could come up with that comes close to how I was feeling. I was home. And I was so joyful. And then I had the knowledge. Once again, it's like you just know everything. I knew I wasn't there to stay. But at that same moment, there was this corridor. And I knew intuitively, I'm to go that way. And I chose to go that way. And as I did, I made my way down the corridor. At the end of the corridor was a crib. Now, Griffin was only 14 months old when he passed. And he was still sleeping in a crib at home. And so I raced to this crib. And there he was. There was my gorgeous little boy. And he was perfect too. And I swept him up as a father does. Have you ever picked up a sleeping child and you feel the weight and the heat of him? And I held him and he was solid against me. It was like such a physical, sensual experience. He was solid. I could feel his ribs expanding with breath. I could feel his warm breath on my neck, and I leaned over and I smelled his hair. You ever smell your child's hair or your partner's hair? It's like, oh. And I began to weep, holding my little boy and thinking how much I loved him. And I'm not pretending that he's a toddler in that other realm, toddling about, but somehow the universe was so kind. It knew the longing of a father's heart to hold my little boy. And as I held him and began to cry, I felt this intense presence come behind me, this overwhelming presence. And it was so powerful and cosmic and wise. In fact, I began to become fearful. My thought was, that's God. And I had grown up believing that life was a test. I was going to be judged, and God was going to judge me. And the guilt began to come up once again that my little boy's here because I crashed the car. I lost control. I wrecked, and he died. And I hope somehow I can be forgiven. And as I had that thought, and this almost felt physical too, I felt these divine arms wrap around me and my little boy and hold us both. And then the lid just came off. Like it was this pouring of peace and trust and love and knowledge. I was told there's nothing to forgive. Everything is in absolute divine order. And I began to see my life. I had the traditional life review. And I would see it and say, oh, no, not that. And the beautiful being that held me said, that's your judgment of it, not ours. We love you. You're as perfect to us as the son you hold. You may be just learning to walk, but we love you and honor every choice. We honor every experience. And in fact, you created it. You created your life. We simply honor it and champion you as you go through your experiences. It was an absolute beautiful downpouring wherein I felt so unconditionally loved, and I felt so absolutely divine. I mean, I felt as if I was divinity, like God held me and I became that. And it was a beautiful, beautiful experience. And we're all divine. I know that the doc has had experiences in the hospital that have proven out the divinity of each and every one of us.
Yeah, I want to share that one of those experiences that had to deal with a homeless man. But I want to share something that deals with fathers and sons first. About 10 months ago, or 8 months ago, my brother came to me again. And he said, I want you to go tell our parents not to be sad anymore. It's been 47 years. He said, I want you to tell them I'm okay, and I want them to smile when they talk about me. And then he took me through a life review. And he showed me a glorious place that a lot of people might characterize as heaven. And when he showed me my life, he showed me these defining moments where the course of my path had changed significantly. And he showed me that it was him that had intervened on those days. And I hadn't realized it until he showed it to me. And so after a few months, I finally worked up the courage to go sit down with my parents and have this conversation with them. And my father told me something that day he'd never told me about the day my brother died. My brother had come to my father and he wanted a new pair of boots, cowboy boots. And they were about $200, and that was a lot of money 47 years ago. And my father said, I can't afford that. And my older brother said, that's fine, I'll go get a job, I'll earn the money. And so he was actually working on a ranch in another part of the county when he tipped the tractor over that killed him. And while my mother's family were telling her, and I heard that cry that seared into my consciousness, an ecclesiastical leader drove 20 miles to my father's workplace to bring him home and to tell him. And my father wasn't in the office when he got there. He was at lunch or in a meeting. And when he came back to the office, here's this ecclesiastical person sitting in his office, which is not usually a good thing. That's like a parent that gets a call from me from the ER in the middle of the night. It's not usually a good thing. And so my father walked into the office, and this man said, "There's been an accident. Stan's hurt." And my father said, "How bad is it?" And the man said, "He's dead." And my father said, "My son's dead for a pair of boots." And just in the last couple of weeks, I've digested this to the point that I realized that's why my brother sent me to talk with our father. He's been carrying this guilt for 47 years. And my brother came back to tell me, go tell him it's not his fault. Let it go. It's about this healing. It's about this love. He's saying, I'm fine. Let it go. So, to get back really quick to that experience you mentioned.
Has to do with boots too. Has to do with boots
It does.
too.
I walked into a room one night, and there was a gentleman on the gurney who was homeless. He had on tattered clothing and a long, unkempt beard and scraggly hair, and he didn't even smell very nice, frankly. And I looked down at his feet, and he had holes in his shoes. And through the holes in his shoes, I could see the holes in his socks. And through the holes in his socks, I could see his injured feet from walking in the cold, wet weather. And I don't even know if we spoke to each other much. I turned to the sink, and I filled a wash basin with some tepid water and put some soap in it. And I grabbed a washcloth, and I could see the anxiety in his face. I could tell he was concerned. He knew what needed to be done, but he was still worried about it. And I sat down at the foot of the gurney, and I took off his shoes, and I removed the remaining threads of his socks. And I lowered his feet into the water, and I began to wash his feet. And I saw who he was. That veil that Suzanne Geisman talked about, that was drawn back. That went away. And I saw his soul. In my book, I think what I wrote was, I saw God. And I was ministering to him, and he was healing and ministering to me. And we are all here to enlighten each other, to help each other heal, to lead each other home. And I was his physician. In many ways, he was my healer that night.
That's the theme I talked about, and I've heard it in many speeches already. Remember who you are. Remember our divinity. Let's get in touch with that. As I wandered the hospital and saw everyone, from the heroin addict to the saintly grandmother, and knew they were beautiful, they were divine, they were perfect, just the way they are. They were so loved. And if I have any message from the NDE, and by the way, you don't have to have a near-death experience. The doc has had as many mystical, transformative, spiritual experiences than I had. I must have been a slow learner, and it took me longer. We all have access to that oneness. We all have access to that unconditional love. We all have access to our own divinity. As we get in touch with that within ourselves, you'll walk around and you'll see everybody so much differently. In fact, I'll invite you, and I make people uncomfortable all the time, but just turn and look at the person next to you. Just turn and look at them, like right in their eyes. And if you've got them on either side, look at both. And we don't do that enough. They say the eyes are the window to the soul. If we could see each other as we really are, in our true magnificence, in our glory, in our divinity, love would conquer all. We wouldn't be going to war and fighting with each other and sending our children to die. We'd probably fall into each other's arms and say, what can I do to serve you today? What can I do to honor the being that you are and the beauty that you bring to this earth? I mean, in the universe, and I love the word universe. Una, like a unicycle, una means one, and verse means song. In being out of the body, I experienced it firsthand. It is all one big, glorious song. And each and every one of us have a tone. We have a tune that we sing. You have a vibration in this entire universe that only you hold, only you bring. Own that. And ask yourself, what can I do? What can I do in this world to make it better, to raise the consciousness, to bring more love, to bring more peace? I mean, I never had any intentions to write a book or to be on stage speaking. I mean, I'm one guy with one leg. But if I can do something in this world to go back home and say, I manifested divine love. And it might have been for the homeless guy whose feet were frozen.
And if I can add just one thing here. I hate it when Jeff does those things with the audience where you make those faces thing. Sometimes I won't go listen to him speak because I know he's going to do that. But I went one time and he told the audience to do that. They stood up. Some people really embrace it. But there was one guy in the room that was even more uncomfortable about it than me. And he was standing right next to me. And he hurries and turns to his wife, and she'd already paired off with her best friend. So there was no place for him to go, no place for me to go. We faced each other, and as we're looking at each other, he starts to get emotional. And he keeps looking away. And I thought, I'm going to look away and make it easier for this guy. But I had written this mission statement earlier that very day. I exist to help souls heal. And I thought, no, I'm going to love him enough to give him what he needs. And I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and we looked at each other, and he broke into tears. And afterwards, he gave me a big hug and thanked me. I didn't know who he was. I'd never met him. But I did some phone calls over the next couple of weeks, and I found out who his wife was. Then I found out who he was, and I communicated with her, and I found out that he had cancer. And when I located him, he was actually in the hospital having surgery, and I arranged to go visit. And I went to the hospital, and we sat down together. I went into his hospital room and sat down with him. And I didn't even ask him what happened. He just started to volunteer it. He said when he looked at me, he said, Spirit spoke to him, and he said, this is a fellow traveler. If you share your story, he will believe you. And then he proceeded to tell me about his recent and profound spiritual journey. And a few days later, a few weeks later actually, he passed. What if I'd have missed out on that? What if I hadn't have followed up on that thing, that little impression, that thought? Jeff and I were talking about this last night. A lot of people come to us and say, how can I have that experience? Come to our workshop tomorrow, by the way. And we have a 2-hour workshop. And the reason we're not doing questions here is if you have questions, come to our workshop tomorrow, and we'll have 2 hours to talk about it. But when people come to me and they say, I never have a spiritual experience, how can I have a spiritual experience? I tell them, and to my knowledge this has never failed, if you want a spiritual experience, do this one thing. When you get centered for your day, whether it's meditation or prayer or exercise or whatever you do to get in your sacred spot, ask this one question. What can I do to serve someone else today? And I promise you, you will get an answer. And if you allow it, it will be a spiritual experience.
It's awesome. We're just about out of time. But as you look at each other, let me just remind you that to look into the face of another person is to see the face of God or the face of divine. So as we wrap up, we're going to be in the bookstore. We're going to sign books. We're doing the workshop tomorrow. You can certainly find us on social media, Instagram and other places. Hug somebody before you leave the room and be open to feeling their divine essence, that vibration that only they carry. And I would invite you to hug somebody you don't even know. Go out of your comfort zone and find somebody that maybe you don't even know, but I promise you in that oneness, you know them, and they know you and your friends that simply haven't met yet.
And when we have our workshop tomorrow, I'm going to tell a story about Jeff hugging people that you're going to love. It's a great story.
It's a great story, but thank you for being so attentive. Thank you for having us. We love you all. We send our love. Find a friend like the doc and you'll be in good shape. Thank you, thank you, thank you.